In the near future, we won't have any oil left. In the near future, the supply of uranium for nuclear power will start to dwindle. In the near future, our natural gas wells will run dry. What does a society dependent on energy do faced with those kinds of shortages? Well, we never found out, because all of those predictions were made decades ago. What does the future of energy look like? Before you respond to that question, keep this in mind. There's a good chance your answer will make people in the future laugh their asses off. Not because people in the future are uniquely mean-spirited, although there is this one guy named Glenn. You know what? We've said too much. It's because there's a pretty consistent history here. When someone makes a confident pronouncement about the future of energy, they're often proven wrong, sometimes outrageously so. In 1977, the White House told Congress that we'd be running out of natural gas by the early part of the 21st century. Between then and now, our natural gas production has looked like this. In the years after World War II, the pioneers of nuclear energy worried that uranium would get so scarce that it would imperil nuclear's future. They did not need to worry about that. Expert predictions that America was going to run out of oil are recorded from as far back as 1919. And if you don't know what this next graph is going to look like, we can't help you. Now, it's easy to laugh at these kinds of predictions. Lord knows Glenn is. But it's also worth asking why even experts in the field have gotten this so wrong. And there are a bunch of answers to that question. One of them is that many of these forecasts just assumed that nothing would ever change, that whatever conditions applied at the time would just go on forever. And that is very much not how the world works. Those huge surges in oil and gas in the early 21st century, they were largely the products of fracking, a new technology that none of the people making those pessimistic forecasts were factoring in. And one of the reasons they weren't factoring it in is that predicting the energy use of the future also requires predicting the economics of the future, which is often even harder. Fracking became economically viable in part because by 2008, American oil production had hit a low of 5 million barrels per day, which sent prices shooting up. Yes, we know that headline looks ridiculous now. It was a simpler time, kids. But can you see the logic here? The supply of gas goes down, which leads to higher prices. But those high prices means there's a lot of money to be made if you can find a way to produce more gas. So when gas prices went up, frackers went to work. And because that eventually resulted in a huge increase in supply, by the mid-2010s, the trend had reversed and gas prices were tumbling. And this wasn't the first time that the underlying economics have driven innovations in energy. In the 19th century, for instance, Americans used oil from sperm whales as a significant lighting source, a factor that played no small part in the practice of whaling. Yet hunting those whales reduced their population, which made the price of the whale oil that much more expensive, which was part of the reason that cheaper coal and kerosene eventually replaced it. This trend was so well understood at the time that Vanity Fair even ran a cartoon showing the whales celebrating the discovery of oil in Pennsylvania, which was a little premature. Because whales were still valuable for a lot of things besides lighting, those oil discoveries allowed for the industrialization of the whaling industry, and now people were just hunting them more efficiently. Like we said, predicting the future is hard. And there's one other factor that makes it even harder to predict the future of energy: politics. Politicians love to tell us that they're in control of the country's energy future, often in defiance of the economic and technological trends that actually drive the sector. As president, for example, Jimmy Carter was one of the people warning that we were simply running out of oil and natural gas. And lest that seem like an unfair caricature,
the oil and natural gas that we rely on for 75% of our energy are simply running out.
That's why Carter pledged that we'd get 20% of our energy from solar power by the year 2000. The actual proportion of our energy America got from solar in 2000, well, it rounded to zero. In 2003, President George W. Bush announced $1.2 billion to ensure that cars using hydrogen-powered fuel cells would be commercially available by 2020, a step that he said would make our country much less dependent on foreign sources of energy. America did get a lot less dependent on foreign sources of energy over that time, but it had a lot more to do with fracking than with cars that run on hydrogen, which, as of today, are only available in California, and which sell at a rate of a few hundred a year. All of which means that when politicians tell us they're reshaping energy, we should take it with a grain of salt. Especially because when they say they're changing the world, there's a big temptation to fudge the numbers. We can see this today with claims that the future will be powered by renewable energy. While it's definitely true that technologies like solar and wind have gotten better over time, some of the more dramatic claims don't exactly stand up to scrutiny. In 2022, for example, there were headlines trumpeting that for the first time, California was meeting all of its electricity needs with renewable energy, which sounds amazing, except you'd need to read the fine print, which would tell you that California ran entirely on renewables for about an hour on a balmy afternoon in April. At 6 a.m. that same morning, there was no solar power, and renewables made up less than a quarter of the electricity supply, which is why the state was relying on natural gas. And by that evening, California was actually importing energy from out of state as renewable supplies nosedived. All of which points to the bigger principle here. The future of energy is, and always has been, intensely practical. What gets the most people the most power at the best price? And any prediction that isn't laser focused on those considerations is likely to be a bad one. So, the next time someone tries to tell you what America's energy future will look like, remember, the more confident the prediction, the more likely it is to be proven wrong. Just ask the whales.